I think apparently you're right because the United States is trying to consolidate its sphere influence in the Western Hemisphere. Sphere influence is a dirty word, but some countries do believe in it. But I think, as far as China is concerned, of course, China would say this is a violation of another country's sovereignty, as all other countries would do. It is noticeable that this time, even America's European allies are reluctant to support the United States because this is really a violation of sovereignty, a core concept enshrined in the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century. So China's attitude is no different, although China's voice is louder. I think what matters is that, okay, what kind of cost or long-term cost would the United States pay for this kind of, behaviors? Because a powerful country normally is generous, and is kind to other nations. But for the strongest nation on earth to behave like this, I think this is not a show of strength. This is an obvious show of America's decline.
Zhou Bo, then just to maybe follow on that, certainly there are questions around the method at which the U.S. approached this, and I think it's certainly not the first time we've seen it. I mean, you look back at recent history. What seems to be clear, though, in terms of the intention, let's talk about the intention, because perhaps that's where we might get a little bit more response, not just from China, is that it seems like Donald Trump specifically and his White House seem to be more assertive in trying to sway their backyard into aligning with them. How do you think China might respond, if at all, to this perhaps more refreshed assertiveness in that part of the world?
Well, I don't believe there is a direct conflict of interest, between China and the United States in the Western Hemisphere, because basically China's involvement is economic in nature. For example, nowadays in Beijing, we're having, loads of cherries coming from Chile. And who can now oppose to China buying cherries from Chile, right? So we're not doing anything massive in terms of military involvement in Western Hemisphere. So I don't believe it's a big issue. Well, they can try the best to consolidate, Western Hemisphere, but that really is an old concept. And nowadays, we're in a globalized world. So this image, this kind of action would certainly be negative, and that's all about it.
The message from the Trump administration seems to be that countries don't get too close to China. Do you think Trump's actions in Venezuela will actually push countries in LATAM, in the Global South, closer to China or push it farther away?
They will definitely put the countries closer to China. Yeah, what the people seem to agree is that now the world has entered into a post-American order, multi-polarization period. So if the United States, is behaving like this, then people's first reaction is a kind of a disappointment, And then, of course, people would look for another force that can actually become kind of a stabilizer or anchor in the world. I think China really falls into this vacuum. Yeah, because if people have no trust of the United States, then they have to look around to look for the anchor. And I believe more and more countries would just support China to be the anchor. Look at the international polls. I believe even in Southeast Asia, the poll is clear that more countries are actually in favor of China. Well, that is obvious because of Gaza, right? And see what the U.S. is doing now. Well, you don't need to have any doubts about international opinion poll, for example, from now on until next year.
Zhou Bo, as you say that, actually, it's quite timely because we've also been covering the visit of the South Korean president. He arrived in Beijing yesterday. In fact, in the last few minutes, separately, CCTV is reporting that President Xi Jinping is meeting or meets the Irish Prime Minister. Do you think in any way, it's the best course of action, what I'm trying to ask, is to do nothing? How does this affect, if any, China's foreign policy priorities this year?
Well, you see, this sudden attack. It should have nothing to do with China, but what I said is my general conclusion. Yeah. So I think things are happening, although in a slow and a steady way. Yeah. So people would realize the international order has changed. So they would look for something else. And right now, it's very important for China to actually demonstrate that it is great power with greater responsibilities. Because China nowadays is very big indeed. China cannot hide behind a tree because you are even taller than the tree. So I think now it's a good chance, for people to come to Beijing to listen to what China says. And I believe China will say the right things.
Yeah, Zhou Bo, I think what you're trying. This is a good opportunity for China to portray itself as a sort of rules-based order, right? Does that mean that China, in some ways, will try to uphold that sort of image versus maybe putting or making more bolder steps towards South China Sea or even Taiwan?
Well, thank you for the good question, because you mentioned the international order. You see, the accusation on China is that China is not obeying the international order. That is wrong, because for me, it's as simple as that. It's very difficult for me to think what kind of international treaties or convention China has not joined. Yeah, it's very difficult for me to think of anything like that. But on the other hand, the United States is clearly violating the international order. So I think when China talks about international order, it is talking about all the rules that we have made, and all the rules that we should follow. China does not have any specific ideas about how it should, follow this order. The orders are just orders. So I think China's responsibility now, during this time of turbulence, is first of all to behave like an anchor. The second thing China should do is to prove that it is indeed a peacemaker. Because if the world is becoming more volatile, definitely there are more opportunities for China to portray itself as a peacemaker, and China is doing that. So sometimes Chinese approaches are just like offering people Chinese medicine. Some people have some doubts whether these Chinese medicine would really work or not. But I believe there is no doubt about China's sincerity, because China is involved in the mediating between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and China has tried successfully to mediate among the different factions of the Palestinians, and China, of course, is also trying to mediate in the war in Ukraine, which is more difficult. But I believe China really has a role, perhaps after ceasefire or armistice in the war in Ukraine, because then people would ask, okay, who's going to guarantee the ceasefire or armistice? And then China probably can do two things. One is that if peacekeeping is needed, China can take the lead, because Russia would not trust any countries coming from NATO countries. Another is probably to provide any security guarantee if that is needed. So there are simply too many things waiting for China to do.
This coming out, I have to say, against a backdrop of one of a very big military drills that we saw in Taiwan from China just a few days ago, Zhou Bo. So I want to ask you, this whole takeover by the U.S. on Venezuela, does that in any way change Beijing's calculus when it comes to Taiwan?
Well, certainly militarily speaking, American strike on Venezuela is a very good example of military success, right? But the Taiwan situation is different. And I believe, politically speaking, as is already mentioned by a spokesman from Ministry of Defense, each provocation coming from Taiwan will invite greater pressure on the Taiwanese authorities until we reach reunification. So the space actually is becoming smaller. So long as they continue to provoke China. So militarily speaking, I believe since the PLA is getting stronger, you are seeing the better coordination of all services. And I believe in the future, this kind of things will just continue. People talk about the status quo in Taiwan Strait. I would argue there is no status quo that is static. yeah, with each provocation and with each response from the PLA, the status quo would be changed irreversibly, yeah, towards the favor of the Chinese mainland.
Yeah, Zhou Bo, the fact, I want to use your analogy, it's a good one. The fact that China can't hide behind a tree because it's taller than a tree. A lot of these things that are happening across the world, and I think you also mentioned that what's happened in Venezuela over the weekend directly does not have anything to do with China. Indirectly, even, you could argue that too. A lot of these things are viewed because of this multi-power world now, because you do have these two superpowers, and commentators are viewing these things against that prism, rightly or wrongly. This is the most important relationship in the world between the U.S. and China. Do you think it's all systems go still as far as the progress between what we have seen last year, this trade détente? Do you think we'll still see those meetings between the two presidents this year in the U.S. and also in China? Is there anything specific you think we should know about what 2026 will hold for that relationship?
Well, you see, David, you're asking a very big question. First of all, I do not believe that we're going to have a Cold War, yeah, in the future, because during the real Cold War that happened, yeah, in last century, every day people were preparing for a hot war. So people only signed with relief after the dissolution of the Soviet Union to say, okay, what happened was but a Cold War. So that means when we look into the future, we don't know what lies ahead, whether it's really a Cold War or it could be a hot war. But generally speaking, with China getting stronger, with China having no intention of exporting its ideologies, so I believe this kind of a competition between China and the U.S. should be more manageable than that between the two superpowers during the Cold War. So I'm sort of more optimistic, and I believe it would be a relationship of competition, as the United States said. Why? Because even if China insists this has to be one of cooperation, it's impossible, because it's the stronger one who can define this relationship, and the United States is still stronger than China. So it is one of competition, but from time to time, I believe there would be détente, yeah, because this whole relationship would not be so, volatile as compared to that between the two superpowers during the Cold War. I think it is manageable, but it certainly means that we have more work to do. Donald Trump is good in that he is not ideological, right? He's transactional. And China didn't find out until Trump's tariff war that we also have our lethal weapons. So this kind of relationship could be balanced.